Wake up him and bandage me. Is it just as everybody, can't you see? He ain't got no future or destiny, but I know where the food in London ought to be. I know where the guns in London ought to be. Said, if you want to live long, baby, just go and run now. And if you don't want to get eaten, just go and run now. And if you see the giant flowers, quick go and run now. And if you see them walk around us, quick go and run now.
Hi, I'm Michael Everts, and this is Fit to be Read. The Day of the Triffids by John Wyndham, published in 1951, is part science fiction, part horror fiction, and is often celebrated as a favorite Wyndham read by many. Triffids attempts to be post-apocalyptic, philosophical, I think, and scary. All three of those are up for debate. The novel places human arrogance, ignorance, short-sightedness, and morality in its crosshairs, and, at times, it hits the target. Let me know in the comments if you've read The Day of the Triffids, if you liked it or not, if you found deeper meaning or symbolism in it, or if you haven't read it and you intend to. I recommend The Day of the Triffids for those who liked H.G. Wells' War of the Worlds because of its pace, aliens potentially around any corner menace, and its England, decades past setting. I recommend Triffids for the obvious fans of science fiction horror genre. Whether it succeeds at delivering nightmare-worthy moments is going to be subjective, but the potential is there. Finally, I recommend Triffids as an introduction to John Wyndham and his, at times, great ability to perfectly capture in words what many of us, maybe, are thinking. Reading this book, I know who this writer is as a storyteller. I didn't love Triffids, but I liked elements of the writing enough that I am certain that I'm going to give this author another shot. This spoiler-free review will include enough to enjoy for those who've already read the book, as well as introduce the novel to those of you who are considering reading it, and don't want me to give anything away. In my 5 likes and 5 dislikes section at the end, I'll really dig into specific moments of the book that I think make or break it. The Day of the Triffids is set in and around 70s-ish London. At the onset of the book, a meteor shower witnessed by a vast majority of the population has rendered everybody blind. Only those in unusual circumstances have escaped the tragedy. Protagonist Bill Mason is one such lucky individual. Because Bill's eyes were bandaged from a previous accident, he was protected from witnessing the heavenly event. Bill leaves the hospital to discover the new normal. Pretty much everybody is blind, save for a few other fortunate souls. The rest of what transpires for Bill, his survival, encounters, adventures, is for the reader to discover. The story feels very local. While the rest of the world, especially America, is alluded to, there's very little world building outside of London and the surrounding area. This book was written in the 50s, and the descriptions of London feel very 60s, from what the streets and shops are like, farming and industry, and the general vibe of the city and the people. There's just one thing out of place, besides everybody being blind, that is, the Triffids. It's not 100% clear where the Triffids came from and if they are connected to the meteor shower, but the prevailing belief amongst biologists, amongst the biologists that we know, Bill Mason, the Triffids were maybe bioengineered by the Ruskies. At the beginning of the novel, Triffids are already a thing. They aren't showing up out of the blue. They're pretty commonplace and people are pretty lackadaisical about them. We know that they come with dangers, but we have them corralled in parks and farms and they're tethered. No big deal. No big deal. What's wrong with these people? No big deal. These suckers can grow over 10 feet tall. They can, I'll just say, pull up their roots and walk around. Not so bad, but they have a huge stinger and they can whip it at you, and they're carnivorous, and guess what? They've developed a taste for little Johnny and little Susie. Still, this is a civilized world. They're managed and harvested for their essential oils. Maybe they give you a nice little pop to your flower bed. Not so fast. Are you people nuts? Blimey. One shot with their long venomous stingers and you're dead. How convenient for these meat eaters, meat consumers, meat metabolizers, that the green haze from the comet storm renders everybody blind. So maybe it wasn't just some Soviet botanical hack after all. This is the part that gives me the heebie-jeebies. It's like being in the ocean at night surrounded by killer whales. At least it could be. Wyndham never turns the dial fully up on the Triffid threat. It has its moments, but there is a lot of real estate in the novel where the threat of Triffids aren't present on the mind. This is a spoiler-free review, so that's as much as we'll discuss with the setting and events. Where Triffids gets most interesting is the questions of morality that come up in a world with such an uneven ratio of sighted individuals to blind individuals, among a landscape littered with man-eating monsters. The horror element of the story falls short because the man-eating monsters thing doesn't live up to the billing, but the morality questions do make for interesting reading and thinking. I'll now litter the rest of this review, including very mild spoilers, with my 5 likes and 5 dislikes for John Wyndham's The Day of the Triffids. Like number 1, continuing my previous thought, the biggest impact the novel had on me is the sort of trolley problem scenarios. Do I do more good and or avoid more loss for the few or for the many? In Triffids, the best rabbit hole worth going down is considering if, as a sighted person, you stick with other mostly sighted individuals as it presents presumably in the world of the novel, the best chance for group survival, or is it more ethical to blend sighted and the blind together to help the blind survive, though doing so presumably makes survival more difficult for the sighted? The conflict of self-survival versus the pull of a moral obligation to the impaired saves an otherwise boring story. Like number 2, I have to give points for storytelling that provides vivid imagery. Wyndham does an info dump on the Triffids or the world in any blatant ways, but I could easily sit and draw a Triffid based off of my reading experience and not off of anything that I've seen on a book cover. It's so vivid that I almost trick myself into thinking I've seen it somewhere, though it's entirely a product of my imagination and Wyndham's words, of course. Like number 3, I thought the different groups that Bill meets are great microcosms and mini-societies, and they're pretty believable. The religious purist who has no plan, just an agenda, and those that are happy to be there simply because somebody else has taken charge. There is the macho militaristic hooligans, dumb and hungry for power, seizing an opportunity and justifying their brutishness with rhetoric about benevolently making the sacrifice to lead the helpless masses, and of course, individuals who just want to go their own way and be left alone. Like number 4 and 5, there is a gem or condemnation of the propensity of humans to drift towards laziness, tucked away in a couple of passages in the second half of the book. The first passage, I didn't know it was there. Besides, I don't know anything about engines or electricity. Coker continued to look at her thoughtfully. So you just went on sitting in the dark, he remarked. And how long do you think you're likely to survive if you just go on sitting in the dark, when things need doing? She was stung by his tone. It's not my fault if I'm not any good at things like that. Admittedly, this is also a point in the book where typical classic science fiction misogyny rears its head, and that is what it is, and it doesn't suit the review to litigate it here, as this next passage further demonstrates how poorly Wyndham condescends to women, while also continuing a great point about laziness and ignorance. I'll differ there, Coker told her. It's not only your fault, it's a self-created fault. Moreover, it's an affectation to consider yourself too spiritual to understand anything mechanical. It is a petty and a very silly form of vanity. Everyone starts by knowing nothing about anything, but God gives him and even her brains to find out with. Failure to use them is not a virtue to be praised, even in women. It is a gap to be deplored. She looked understandably annoyed. Coker himself had been annoyed from the time that he came in. She said, I don't see why you need to pour all your contempt for women onto me just because of one dirty old engine. Coker raised his eyes. Great God, and here have I been explaining that women have as many brains as anyone else, if they'd only take the trouble to use them. Dislike number 1. It was very difficult for me to buy in with how immediately distraught Bill and really everybody else was. With little passage of time and venturing no more than a block or maybe 2, Bill assumes that the world has ended and he reacts accordingly. It's as if he just automatically draws a conclusion that I'm also supposed to draw, that we're now in a post-apocalyptic world. Granted, if I walk outside and everybody but me is blind, I'm gonna freak the tuck out. The deal is, though, that you can't pretend that we're all on the same page, that we live in a nightmare world, because strange things are happening outside of a hospital in London. This set a tone that was hard to shake for the first half of the book. Dislike number 2, Bill proves to be wise in his concern about Triffids eventually, but presenting it as his number one fear right from the get-go is just as premature as assuming the world has ended. Of course be terrified of Triffids, but how is it that their first concern relative to everything else that could be a danger in this new assumed world order is Triffids? Dislike number 3, the world order. Where is the government, the bureaucracy, law enforcement, anything to support that pre-chaos there was some sort of functioning government or system of laws? Of course, that probably doesn't make for captivating chapters, but give me something, even one guy in a military jeep driving around. It's not a huge deal, but it further keeps the novel untethered to reality. In a book with killer walking plants, you need to have some things that make the world believable. Dislike number 4, I wanted Wyndham to actually deliver on the horror, and he absolutely did not. There were moments that I could tap into how terrifying it would be to be blind with Triffid monsters, able to whip and end you at any moment. It delivered that same sense I mentioned of being in deep water surrounded by predators. That's fun, I think. Dislike number 5, once Bill is freed from his captors, he does very little to find Gisela. He gives up the search ridiculously fast and moves on with Coker as if it were no big deal. Don't get me wrong, I'm indifferent about that character, but it seems odd for the story. Eventually his connection and desire for her develops more significantly, but first time around, it's sort of teased that he must find her, and when he looks left and then right, he has an attitude of, well, she's gone. Off we go, buddy. Thank you for watching. I'm Michael Everts, and this is Fit to be Read.